It's time for another Morning Pointe Foundation Caregiver Cafe, part of the work of the Morning Pointe Foundation, providing nursing scholarships and caregiver support programs across the Southeast. Thank you, donors, for supporting our 4 annual Seniors Got Talent shows and our 2 annual golf events. And now, bi-monthly virtual caregiver cafes featuring senior living experts. This episode features Dr. David Hutchings, a Ph.D. in geriatric neuropathology and a dementia specialist, Spring Hill, Tennessee. Dr. Hutchings works with the Alzheimer's Association on the state and national levels for clinical education. He serves as a faculty member at John Patrick University in the Department of Dementia Alzheimer's Medical Program and co-chairs the university's Cognitive and Memory Disorders Clinic. He is founder of Dementia and Alzheimer's Care, LLC, a private practice firm focused on the evaluation, treatment, and clinical education of all forms of dementia. Please welcome Dr. David Hutchings to the Morning Pointe Foundation Caregiver Cafe.
Good evening, everyone. And we're very, very excited in partnership with Morning Pointe to be offering not only the Caregiver Cafe, but also for the first time, we'll be offering CEUs tonight. We're offering 1.5 contact hours CEUs for tonight's content. So we have a lot to cover this evening. I'll be talking quite a bit about, of course, dementia, the different forms of dementia. We're going to go a little bit further in depth in terms of the clinical pieces of this, the pathology, the neuropathology pieces of it, but also talking about dementia staging and also medication management. That's going to be a big thing that we really want to talk about. I am going to speak for about an hour, and then we're going to open up to some Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen, everyone. So give me 1 second here, and we will get started. Okay, so we are off to the races here. So again, thank you everyone for jumping on this evening. And just as a reminder, when you finish up this evening, to go ahead and fill out your survey for your CEUs. And in the introduction, you heard that I started my practice with dementia and Alzheimer's care. It got to a point where I had so many patients I couldn't keep up. So almost 2 years ago, I partnered with Blue Sky House Calls. So I'll be giving their contact information towards the end of the session here. You're going to find over the next hour that I have an incredible passion for these patients, this diagnosis, and also for the caregivers. And I want to really emphasize the caregiver part throughout tonight's evening presentation. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about, prevalence and statistics. This is an epidemic, and I will be talking about how much of an epidemic this truly is and how much it's having an impact not only on where you are, but on the overall healthcare system too. And also the difference between dementia and normal aging. I had my brother called me the other day, and he has a neighbor, and he said that she's, up all night and having all these issues. And he's like, well, she's just getting older and getting dementia. And that's just such a thing out there that so many people think that this is a part of normal aging. So we're going to talk about that. We are going to talk a little bit about prevention as well. That's one of the biggest questions that I get, and I'm sure that you get as well as healthcare professionals, is how can we prevent acquiring Alzheimer's disease? We will talk about the progressive neurological dementias. We do not have time to go into every single one. There's 85 different things that can cause somebody to have dementia, but we're going to be talking about more the ones that we see the more often. And then most importantly, we're going to be talking a lot about the dementia staging piece, because that's one that I feel that we don't talk enough about. So I want to make sure that we do talk about dementia staging and how that comes into play into care planning and also medications. Okay, so let's talk about prevalence and statistics. So basically, to kind of sum up this slide, is we have what we call this geriatric silver tsunami, where we have roughly 7,918 people every day turning 65. So with that being said, that's the amount of people that are turning 65. But we also have what the research refers to as the gray tsunami of all the patients that are being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Right now, we have a diagnosis every 65 seconds. Somebody is being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. 1 out of 3 seniors will pass away from Alzheimer's disease. So we're seeing that that the prevalence is higher. And I was doing an Alzheimer's support group the other night, and one of the questions that we had was, why are we seeing so many more patients diagnosed? And I'm going to answer that question kind of out of basically two sides of my mouth here. Number one, we are seeing it because we are able to diagnose more types, number one. But then if I was to sit here and tell you that people are living longer, or let me say, there people are not living longer, you'd probably think I was crazy. But people are actually living longer with chronic diseases. So with our ability to diagnose better, diagnose more types of dementia, and we know that people are living longer with chronic diseases, this is the reason that we're seeing so many more diagnoses that have come over the last 10 to 15 years. You know, we look at the assisted living facilities, which here in Blue Sky, we do service the living community quite often. We see about 68% of those patients that have some form of dementia. Out of that 68%, we see about 34% of them having significant behavioral problems. And we're going to talk a lot about that in terms of medications. When we talk about sundowning is incredibly curable. We have mood swings, we have aggression. So we're going to be talking about that and what medications we know work the best for those types of symptoms. And if we look at that assisted living facility setting, of that 68%, 27% of these patients are considered to be more moderate to severe. So it is definitely an epidemic. The funding is getting better. I can tell you within the last 10 years, AIDS research was getting more funding than Alzheimer's. So, you know, we are making advances in research and also into finding a cure. So next, I want to introduce you to Grace Kirkland. I bring Grace to a lot of my lectures because every time I see her, I see something different, and it does bring into light, as we talk about tonight, the types of dementia, how to deal with the behaviors, and getting people to understand that dementia does not only impact memory. Remember, the brain, it controls everything we do. It processes up to 4 million things a second. It's an amazing thing to think about. But by definition of dementia, yes, I can give you a textbook definition here of all the textbooks in my office, but it is a complete deterioration of all mental and physical functions. But I've had a patient one time, I'll never forget her. She came to me and said, I just don't feel like the person I used to be. And I thought that probably was one of the greatest definitions of dementia that I've ever heard. But I want to introduce you to Grace Kirkland. I've had the great opportunity to meet this family. Grace, when she was about 66 years old, she started recognizing that she was having some memory issues. Dr. Kirkland, he was a Ph.D. in physics at Johns Hopkins University. That was her husband. And they were approached about doing a documentary on Grace to follow her throughout the progression of the illness. She loved to be a part of a church. She was in the choir. She liked to sew. She liked to cook. So she was like many of the people that you're listening to me now that are either in your family or even your own patients. So throughout this evening's lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 clips of Grace, and I want you to pay attention to how she acts and what she's doing. But also I want to say, in medicine, we are always trained to figure out what is wrong with a patient and how do we fix that. With Grace tonight, what I want you to observe is what is wrong, yes, but what can she still do? So this is the first of the 3 clips I'll be showing this evening.
And tomorrow's Sunday, isn't it?
Is tomorrow Sunday?
Tomorrow's Sunday. What do you do on Sundays?
We go to church and sing a song, sing. So,
What songs do you sing in church?
Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so.
What about, do you sing, glory, glory?
Glory to hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. He's coming again to take me to heaven.
That was a nice end. You put a different end on it than I know.
Riddle, R-I-D-D-L-E, R-I-D-D-L-E.
You got that one real fast.
Well, I work these old puzzles so much, and I know. S-Q-U-A-R-D-A-N-C-E.
Guess you found it already.
I can see these in my sleep almost.
So what we see out of Grace so far, I wish I could be with you all in person and get your feedback. But what I see from Grace is that her weight looks good. She's interactive. She is able to find the word, so she has the attention to do so. But also what I noticed from Grace is a couple things that I always kind of pick up on new things when I see her and watch this documentary. Number one, the change of her environment. We have probably a psychiatrist or a psychologist with her. She looks very kind of pulled back in her demeanor. She even looks at the camera. It's a change in her environment. Further on, her speech patterns are somewhat changed. I don't like to use the word childlike, but they're very pragmatically somewhat like that. But also, if you noticed, Grace never actually spoke through the entire video. She sang. And so patients at certain stages, as we'll go into staging here in just a little bit, will use compensatory techniques to either mask the illness or get around the some of the deficits that are occurring. But if we look at dementia by definition, again, going back to my patient's response of I just don't feel like the person I used to be, I think is a beautiful way of describing it. And if I could go back and look at this slide, I would say that yes, I put memory loss as the last on purpose, because we see emotional abilities change. We see fluctuations in mood. We see personality changes. We see the loss of the ability to problem solve. So these things are not part of the normal aging. So when we look at dementia, and I use this analogy a lot, I want us to think about dementia as an umbrella diagnosis, that just like if it was cancer, we have many different types of cancer underneath that umbrella. Well, same thing for dementia. It's an umbrella, and we have many different kinds, and so many people latch on to Alzheimer's, and we're going to talk a lot about more of that here in just a moment. It is not a part of the normal aging process. We just don't get older and develop dementia. But if we see things that are cognitive impairments that are not a part of normal aging, again, if you look down this slide here, I see the indecisiveness, losing track of daily events, or difficulty handling money is a really, really big one. Repeating questions over and over, or just kind of forgetting how we've done things in the past. I had a patient today that she absolutely loved to cook. She loved to make brownies and all these things, especially, with Thanksgiving coming up, and she's unable to follow those recipes anymore. So these are things that we've kind of the loss of things that we were normally able to do. So remember, it's not something only impacting memory, but it's more than that. Now, this next slide is something that I'm sure a lot of you may not know. And this is something to bring back, is because whenever I have a patient that comes to me with a dementia diagnosis, let's say it's Alzheimer's dementia, I'm always questioning, does this patient truly have Alzheimer's? So if we look at the word dementia, I need this patient and their symptoms and pathology to prove to me this is truly a progressive neurological condition. So if we look at dementia, it's an acronym. We can have, it can be from depression or drugs. I had a lady not too long ago that was loaded up on pain medications because she had rheumatoid arthritis. And that was causing her to have all this memory issues, which gave her an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And it wasn't truly Alzheimer's, it was the medications. We also have pseudodementia, which is caused by depression. I saw a lady on Monday who literally looked like an Alzheimer's patient. When I tested her, she looked just like Alzheimer's. But when I did the MRI, I realized this isn't Alzheimer's at all. This is simply depression. The endocrine system, the thyroid can play a significant role in memory issues, especially if we have hypothyroidism. It could be metabolic, it could be epilepsy, it could be poor nutrition, it could be toxicity, and especially if a patient has gone through multiple surgeries, that's something that can cause a lot of memory issues, or it could be more structural or cardiovascular related. So I mentioned a moment ago that we have 85 different forms of dementia. And if in the next slide, we're going to go into more of the ones that we see the most often, the more that are progressive neurological. Of those 85, you might think I was crazy to tell you that the majority of dementias are actually fixable and curable. And I have multiple patient examples of that. But of the progressive neurological dementias, we do see that they do have a lot of things that are not common with each other. But what we do see is they have 5 things that are common. Number one, yes, they have the memory impairments. Yes, they have some short-term memory issues. They may have other cognitive areas, but also language. And we saw this with Grace just now, is if we have a patient who's had a stroke and they lose the ability to speak, that language area is sitting right next to the short-term area memories of the brain. So we'll see patients have the inability to find words or complete thoughts. And this is the language comparison to that. They also have apraxia. And remember, dementia is not something that only impacts memory. And what happens here is that the brain has a cell phone signal between the brain and the arms, the legs, walking, all this stuff. And that cell phone signal is disrupted. So if you are with your patients, or if you're a caregiver that's listening tonight, I want you to try to write the word association, or maybe even write a sentence or your name, but do it with your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, try writing with your left. And that's what it feels like to have apraxia, where, and think about that from a talking standpoint, from a walking standpoint, we're losing that motor movement. Agnosia is where a patient is unable to recognize a loved one or a location. My wife's my father-in-law is a patient at Morning Pointe in Spring Hill, and my wife came home last Sunday and she was just in tears because he's not able to recognize her, and that's the agnosia piece of it. And then we also have attention issues. And this is the big deal this time of year right now, because a lot of times we want to take our loved ones home, maybe for memory care, and take them out to eat. And it's a lot of things coming in at one time for that patient. So it can create a lot of anxiety and a lot of it kind of works the patient up a little bit. So let's get into the most common forms of dementia. And it's basically a whole nother lecture for each one of these, but I want to break this down where we can understand it clinically. And again, if you're on and you're a caregiver listening in, I want to make sure that we understand what happens in each one of these dementias and how much they're different. If we look at Alzheimer's disease, we've all heard the differences. We've heard the plaques and the tangles and all this. So I want to kind of break that down a little bit. So what happens with Alzheimer's is that we do have plaques and tangles. And what happens is that because there is a gene that mutates, and that whole gene's role is to help clear out the fats and the lipids in the brain. And the neurons in the brain are almost like teenage girls on cell phones. They love talking back and forth. When we get too much plaque accumulated on those neurons are no longer able to communicate anymore. And so they begin to harden, and then they begin to shrink. And then we have the actual tangle. And I want you to think about the tangle as like a railroad track. And in a railroad track, we have two parallel bars that are running side by side, but we have this structure of the railroad track that have these perpendicular bars, okay? And what happens with Alzheimer's is those perpendicular bars, they're called tau proteins, and they deteriorate. So once that happens, that railroad track no longer has stability. And so it begins to twist and tangle. And this is the reason that we see what we call cerebral atrophy or shrinking in the brain. We can't see that on a CT scan. We have to have an MRI to be able to see that. So some common myths that we see here is memory loss is a part of normal aging. That is false. Your brain is the greatest organ that God's ever put in your body. It is literally the only organ in the human body that is aware of its own existence. It slows down as we get older, just like a computer does. But when we have true memory loss, that's not a part of normal aging. Alzheimer's disease is not a fatal disease. That's not true either, because we have had no survivors of Alzheimer's because of all the symptoms that come from that disease itself. And I'll be glad to answer some questions on that when we kind of wrap up the lecture portion. Only older people get Alzheimer's. I diagnosed somebody on Tuesday, Tuesday, that was 42 years old with Alzheimer's disease. This is not a disease that only impacts older people. And then there are no treatments to stop the progression. And that is true to a certain extent. If a patient has really used their brain throughout their life, then we can certainly see some of the progression slow down a little bit. Now, I had published an article a couple of years ago that talked about how can we prevent dementia. If you'd like a copy of this article, I'll give you my contact information when we wrap up. But what I was fascinated about is that we see the apolipoprotein number 4, which is the Alzheimer's gene. We see this more prevalent in the Nigerian population, but we see some of the lowest prevalence of Alzheimer's in that population. It's because they have good sleep hygiene. They follow more of a Mediterranean diet. They're not eating large meals before they go to bed. Yes, they have the physical exercise, but also the cognitive exercise. And one of the things that we saw during COVID was the isolation. I saw so many of my patients decline because we're made to be social. It stimulates your brain in so many different ways. A good mood, meaning chronic depression, chronic anxiety, these things can certainly be a precursor. And of course, alcohol and moderation, maintaining a healthy weight, and also not smoking. So if you'd like more detail on that article, I'll be happy to share that with you. Now, my stepfather has vascular dementia. Vascular dementia used to be the second most common form of dementia. And I put that on there on purpose because it's no longer the second most common form. Lewy body dementia is, which I'll be talking about here in just a moment. But vascular dementia literally sometimes looks, I have a patient right now who's a retired physician. He has vascular dementia, and he literally looks like he has Parkinson's disease. His gait patterns are shuffling. There's a lot of kind of postural issues there. So what happens is when we have a cardiovascular history, whether it's we've got atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, we've had a stroke, we've had TIAs, this puts us at a higher risk for vascular. And if we look at imaging and what that looks like on an MRI, we can see that there's these little white specks all over the brain. Like this insult here was probably a stroke. Some of these other ones are mini strokes, but also you can see this gapping here in the brain, which would indicate that we're having the atrophy or the shrinking of the brain. This moves differently. than Alzheimer's. This basically, Alzheimer's kind of moves as a sloping progression, where in vascular, we see it more like a stairwell. Patients are very fluctuating. Like my stepfather, I can talk to him, and some, like, moment for moment, one moment he's perfectly fine, other moments he's not. He's very, very up and down. So it's like a stairwell where we plateau for a while, and then we'll have a quick little drop. We'll plateau for a while, and then we'll have a quick little drop. But there's also areas in vascular where we do have, yes, we have the gait issues, we have the fluctuations in memory, but we also can have some chronic insomnia, and also some hallucination behaviors as well, which we're going to talk more about that here in just a bit. Again, we could go into a whole lecture on each one of these, but I want to make sure I get into the staging and medication management pieces as well. When I finished residency in 2009, I diagnosed someone with Lewy body dementia. And I remember the neurologist looking at me and saying, well, Dr. Hutchings, that is just a textbook term. But then we had Robin Williams, and then we had a lot more publicity on Lewy body dementia. As I mentioned, my father-in-law has Lewy body. And what is critical about this diagnosis is that if you don't know what you're looking for, you will miss it every time. If you know what you're looking for, then it sticks out like a sore thumb. The other critical part here is that if we're suspecting Lewy body and we treat this patient like an Alzheimer's patient or like a vascular dementia patient, they will decline rapidly. Case in point, my father-in-law has Lewy body. He was up in Kansas City. They diagnosed him with Alzheimer's disease. They put him on risperidone, which the side effects of risperidone causes Parkinson's disease or Parkinson's symptoms. So here we are giving a Parkinson's patient medications that have side effects of causing Parkinsonians. But here's what this looks like, is that with Lewy body, we have a lot of hallucinations and delusions, very vivid hallucinations. We typically see this onset around the age of 70 to 74 years old. And they also have chronic insomnia and very fluctuating memory. So very up and down. Sometimes they can be clear as a bell, but then other times they're in that delusional state, but a lot of chronic insomnia and hallucinations. The difference between these two Parkinson's related dementias is that if we have the hallucinations, we have the memory issues, we have the fluctuations in memory, we have all these things happening, and then we develop Parkinson's type symptoms, that's Lewy body. If it's reversed in nature, and we have Parkinson's first, and then develop the hallucinations and sleep issues and memory problems, that's Parkinson's with dementia. But I have to really push this as hard as I can to all the health care practitioners that are listening, is that if we treat these patients with the wrong medications, we can accelerate this dementia and make it worse. So going back to the cancer analogy, we got to know what type of cancer we're dealing with. We have to know what stage we're in. And then the next question is, how do we treat it? And we should be asking these exact same questions when it comes to dementias. The next dementia is fairly rare. These are frontal temporal lobe dementias. It usually onsets between 40 to 65. They tend to be quite a bit more hereditary in nature. The life expectancy is quite a bit shorter. It's the 6 to 8 year life expectancy. But we do have multiple different forms of this. The most common form is a behavioral variant. I saw a lady this morning that has behavioral variant, and her brother just recently passed away. And her response was, okay, so what? Like, she has lost all empathy. She's lost that social filter. They'll say things socially inappropriate, sexually inappropriate. They've lost the frontal portion of the brain that really controls that social filter. And then we have primary progressive aphasia. And if you can think about trying to go to, let's say if you go to Mexico for a vacation, you do not speak Spanish, nor do you understand Spanish. That's what it would feel like to have primary progressive aphasia. Their memory is intact for quite some time, but they lose the ability to understand speech and produce speech. So if we look at what this looks like on the brain, you can see that we have the posterior portion of the brain is well intact. The balance is good. We're going to have some visual impairments, but you can see the frontal portion here is your ability to multitask, your executive functioning, your language areas. So this is what it would look like where primarily this dementia has impacted the frontal portion of the brain. I had a lady of mine with primary progressive aphasia, a very sweet lady. I've treated her for years. She unfortunately passed away last week. And no matter how bad the disease got, every time I walked in the room, she'd wrap her arms around me and hug me and recognize me. So it's a different type of dementia where we take that same patient who has Alzheimer's, and then what happens there is that they would lose the ability to recognize loved ones and spouses. So one thing I want us to understand, and I really focus on this in our Alzheimer's support groups, is getting us to understand that dementia is much more than memory. Yes, we have immediate memory issues. That's kind of recall within about 10 seconds or so. Up to about 20 minutes is our short-term memory. And then we have long-term memory, which is like 20 minutes and past that. But remote memory is, where did you grow up? Who are your parents? Who's your spouse, your children? These are all things that are much further engraved in the brain past long-term memory. We also lose the ability to have semantic memory, which is memory from fact. We know that 3 times 3 equals 9. Or episodic memory. I drive to work in different memory care facilities every single day, and I have an episode. I know exactly how to get there. But we see this breakdown in bathing, dressing, following recipes, these types of things that we have to have very steps that have to be in place. And then we also have the loss of divergent thinking and problem solving. We have the loss of common sense and problem solving, where we can problem solve through different types of problems that may arise. So again, the language, and I'll say here on the language, even though if your loved one, your patients cannot express themselves and they have a difficulty producing speech, they can still understand, because the understanding portions of the brain, the understand language is preserved for quite some time, because they're located close to the long-term area of memory of the brain. So when you're with your patients or you're with your loved one, speak directly to them. Even though they have the loss of language, they can still very well understand you. So the second video, Grace, I'm going to show you is just a few years later from the first clip. And I want you to take a look at the change that she's had, look at what she's doing and what she's unable to do.
Oh, tells me so.
Good. Okay, very good.
Take some lunch. That's it. It's been 10 years since Grace was diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease. I have retired and stay home, caregiving for Grace full time.
No, just wait a minute. Just a second here. Just a second. No, just a minute.
Over the years, Grace's condition has deteriorated. Her memory loss is so extreme that she can no longer take care of herself.
She normally can eat reasonably well once I get her started.
So if we look at Grace, number one, if you notice, she kind of moves throughout her home, not knowing really where to go. Going back to what I mentioned on the 5 A's, that's the agnosia piece of that. She's not able to really recognize her environment. I really when I caregivers at caregiver conferences or Alzheimer's support groups, my heart breaks for them because this is a disease that is not only impacting the patient, but it also impacts the caregiver to a tremendous amount. I'll say this is that they are slowly grieving. But I watched Dr. Kirkland in those videos, and he's so calm. His voice is calm. He redirects her, and he works. I mean, this is like the true notebook story that I see on a daily basis. But something else I noticed with her is that she's had an extreme loss of weight. And I am always looking at that. I want to make sure my patients are maintaining weight and nutritional status. But again, we're seeing here a bigger picture that this is not just memory. Changes a person's personality. It can make them have bipolar and mood swings, and we can have aggression, and we can have all these different things, but we also have the physical piece. You can even see Grace not moving around a lot. Her gait patterns are changing. So that's the thing that we really have to reiterate to our patients, because what's happening is that they come in, they'll get the diagnosis, and then that's it. They get put on Aricept or Namenda, and they're sent home. And they're not given any what's going to come next. What stage are we in? And what decisions do we have to make? So I think as a healthcare community, we have to do a better job at really preparing families for what's coming next. So we're going to get into that now. We're going to get into the medications and also the staging. When it comes to medications that help improve memory, I'm going to again speak out two sides of my mouth. I think these medications work very well in the early stages. Aricept tends to be one of the ones we use the most. It can have some side effects of nausea, diarrhea, vivid dreams. We can have some leg cramping, that kind of stuff. Namenda tends to be one of my more favorite ones. We've had some recent case studies that are coming out now, indicating that if we take patients off of Namenda, then we could see a decline. Excuse me. So I've been trying to keep my patients on Namenda, but I will discharge Aricept when we get to a certain stage, and I'll talk about staging here in just a moment. So medications. When my father-in-law came, I called his doctor because I was concerned about the medications he was on. Remember, he's got Lewy body dementia, and he was on medications again that were causing side effects that were accelerating the dementia. He was not able to use the bathroom. He could not talk, walk, anything. I mean, he at Morning Pointe did me quite a favor by taking him in. But by the time I got his medications corrected, within about a week and a half, he was able to walk, talk, use the bathroom, take his medicines. He still has Lewy body, yes, but physically he improved so much. We have to make sure we're on the right medication regimen. One of the more successful medications that we use to treat paranoia, sundowning, hallucinations, sleep issues, Seroquel tends to work the best with this. Not in all patients, but it tends to be a medication that I can use that will help us with sleep issues and the paranoia, the anxiety, sundowning, all of it. So for example, if I have a patient that's sundowning at 4 o'clock in the evening, I can set that Seroquel dosage at 4 o'clock, and that Seroquel is going to be kicking in by the time they start to sundown. Now, trazodone is a very safe sleep sedative. And remember, the brain controls everything. I live on a farm. And so when I wake up in the morning, it doesn't matter if it's a Saturday and I want to sleep in, I'm still getting up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, no matter what. Well, that sleep-wake cycle is controlled by an area of the brain. And if we do not have sleep, then the memory is going to get worse, and also the behaviors and some of those other things could get worse too. So that's one of the first questions I ask is, how are we sleeping at night? Are we getting at least 6 to 7 hours of deep sleep? Mood stabilization. That's something else. You think about medications like Depakote, Zyprexa, these different medications we use to help stabilize mood. Think about this like bipolar, okay? We have a patient that in some cases, a lot of cases, they know something is going on with their memory, and it's going to cause this fluctuation in mood all day. So if I'm looking at this list, do I want my loved one to take some Aricept and hopefully, fingers crossed, we improve short-term memory for a short period of time? Or do I want to treat the psychosis? Do I want the patient, I don't want them to being anxious. I don't want them to have sleep issues. I don't want them hallucinating. I don't want I'd rather treat that and treat the symptoms. I can't cure the dementia, but by golly, I can treat the symptoms itself. So there are a lot more medications here we could talk about. I do all the time see depression as a part of this too. Depression and anxiety need to be treated separately. So we do have to look at the SSRIs. I would definitely stay away from what we call benzodiazepines. So for the clinical folks on tonight, you know what those are. But for the non-clinical folks that are on, that is going to be your Xanax, your Klonopin, your Ativan. These medications are good in low dosages. Ativan tends to be one of the better ones, but we try to use it only on a pure, on a PRN basis. These medications can actually have the opposite effect sometimes. I had a lady last week that was just bouncing off the walls, and she was getting Xanax 3 times a day, because we may take a Xanax and it may calm us down, but some of these patients will take it and it can hype them up. So it can have the opposite effect. But even more so, these medications can increase fall risk. And we already know that gait patterns are going to be disrupted in all patients with dementia. So if we're trying to use some of these medications to help with sleep and anxiety, they're not going to work for very long. Plus, the body builds up a tolerance. So we have to, now if we know that, okay, we have a patient with Lewy body or whatever type of dementia that we're dealing with, Alzheimer's or whatever it is, now we know, okay, here's the medications that we know that can help with this. So the next thing is we need to talk about staging. Now, some of the tests that are out there, if you look here, the mini mental status exam, I'll be honest with you, this thing has been out there since Adam and Eve were eating the apple. I'm not a big fan of the mini mental. I am a big fan of the rest of those tests on there, and I'll tell you why we use them. But the mini mental does not go far enough in depth enough to give us an actual stage. But this slide here, I think, will help you practitioners, because if you are relying on the mini mental, this is what the research breaks down to of what the scores mean in terms of a patient's function. So if we have a high score, a perfect score is 30, and if we're a 25 to 30, we can have difficulties with walking, keeping appointments, medication management, which is a huge one. And then we can have some problems with higher level ADLs. When we get into 20 to 15, their overall safety in the home is an issue. Bathing, grooming, dressing, the ability to communicate. And once we get below 15, remember 30 is a normal score, this is where we can have eating issues, problems with swallowing, which increases our risk for pneumonia. We can have decreased appetite. So the point of these tests is, if I just came to you and said, hey, Miss Smith, Mrs. Smith has a mini mental score of, 19 out of 20 or 19 out of 30 rather. That doesn't mean anything at all. So we have to explain what these tests mean. And so whenever I have patients do the clock drawing test, I don't care if a patient can draw a clock, but I am looking at how the numbers are spaced. And so once I draw a circle and then I have them put the numbers around the clock, you'll see so many times these patients will put all the numbers on one side of the circle, or they'll have large gaps in between each number. So that tells me two things. Well, actually tells me three things. Number one, they have spatial orientation deficits. There is study after study after study comparing clock drawing tests to falls. So if we have a spatial orientation deficit that we see on the clock drawing test, that tells me that patient's at a significant risk for falling. But also it tells me that they shouldn't be driving because the spatial awareness is off. If a car stops in front of a person, you know to apply your brakes slightly. Where if their visual spatial is off, then we know this patient should not be operating a vehicle. So it tells us a lot more than just can a patient draw a clock. Now, again, going back to that cancer analogy, if somebody came to me and said, Dr. Hutchings, you have cancer, I would want to know what type do I have, what stage am I in, and how the heck are we going to treat it? And that's what I want us to get out of tonight. The staging is so critical because not only does it tell us where we're at, but it also tells us what's coming next. And if I can say a patient is at this stage, and I can tell you within 18 to 24 months, they're going to go to this stage, and the next thing we need to figure out is 24-hour care, or this is going to be a stage where she may not recognize you. And I can really give the families an idea of what's coming next, but it allows us to be ahead of the disease process. So when I'm staging people, I'm looking at 5 areas. And I want you to think about the staging as 0 is normal and 7 is profound. So same thing on this concentration. So I'm rating concentration on the 0 to 7 scale. I'm looking at recent memory, 0 to 7 scale, past memory, orientation, ADLs, 0 to 7 scale. So let's take, for example, we have a patient that, and you may not have a pencil in front of you, but I'll do the math for us. Let's say we are a 5 on concentration. We're a 5 on short-term memory. We're a 4 on past memory. And then we have 5s on orientation and ADLs. If I add all those scores up and divide by 5, I'm going to get a 4.8. And that's going to put us into the staging. So it goes down to the decimal point. So we don't actually have dementia till we get to stage 4.0. And I feel like in my experience that stage 4.0 is probably one of the most difficult stages because we have moderate cognitive impairments, but the dementia is mild. And the patient is very aware that something's wrong. And this is where we see a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, because part of the brain that's intact is almost battling with part of the brain that's not. And let's just say I have this patient who's a 4.0. Then I can go to the family and say, okay, the next stage is going to be 5. So if we have Alzheimer's, it takes about 18 to 24 months for us to go from one stage to the next. But when we reach stage 5, this is critical because this is moderately severe cognitive impairment with a moderate dementia, whatever type of dementia that we've diagnosed. But what's critical here is that this is where a patient is no longer able to live without some type of assistance, whether it be memory care, 24/7 care in the home. They have to have 24-hour care assistance. And when we get to this stage, it has a tremendous impact on the caregiver. Y'all, we have seen ER rates nearly quadruple for the caregivers. And we're actually seeing in many cases that the patients are outliving the caregivers because it is such a burden. And I don't mean that as a bad word, but it is such a burden on the caregiver to care when we get to that stage 5. So I can tell a patient now and a family and say, this is vascular dementia. We're a stage 3.8. This is how long it's going to take for us to get to a stage 4, stage 4.0, 4, 4.6, stage 5. So I can now put a plan in place for this patient. And I've already queued up the medications I know that this patient's going to need based on that type of dementia, and I have a stage. So I can titrate those medications up as the patient progresses through that staging process. So the staging is absolutely critical. And I'll say this too, is that once we get into that mid-6 range, this is where we will start to have a conversation about hospice. And I'll tell you the reason I'm saying this is because I am not a fan of nursing homes, okay? And I hope that doesn't offend anybody on here. I'm just not a fan of them. So if I know we're approaching this, and let's just say that a patient, I've got several right now I can use examples of, but I got a lady right now that I can use for an example. I brought in hospice, not because she has 6 months to live, because I've had patients that's been on hospice for 2 or 3 years. Hospice is wonderful. But if they're in memory care and that patient is no longer able to really to help with bathing and dressing and toileting and feeding, hospice brings in a nurse. They also bring in a caregiver to help that patient with those things, but it also keeps the patient in that memory care facility or at home or whatever it may be. So I kind of use it as a trick of trade because I know they're going to need it. I know at what time in a time frame they're going to need it, but it allows that patient to age in place. So staging is critical. So now we know the type of dementia, the medication regimens we know work for each form, but then now we know the stage, and now we are ahead of that disease. The next thing is the caregiver burden index. And this is something I do a lot on my patients because I feel like I have two patients. I have the patient and the caregiver. So many times, I do at least 2 Alzheimer's support groups every single week. And when we do have care for their loved ones, you see the spouses not have guilt, but they feel like they have a weight off their shoulders where they know their loved one, their spouse is being taken care of, but I had a lady yesterday in an Alzheimer's support group. She said that she went to go vote and she had to wait in line for 30 minutes and the sun was out, there were kids around. And she's like, that was the best 30 minutes I've had in almost 3 years. Like she was crying, like it was emotional. So I would say that if you're listening tonight and you're a caregiver, you have to take care of yourself. Remember, this is not a disease that only impacts memory. It impacts all mental and physical functions, but also has a tremendous impact on the caregiver. And you're actively grieving, whether you realize it or not. These families are actively grieving, spouses, children, grandchildren. And it's the grieving process is not like, hey, I've gone through this one, check. I've gone through this one, check. We can be bouncing through all of them for quite some time. So if you're a caregiver, I cannot say this enough. You have to take care of yourself. So when we look at care planning, this is where we ultimately want to keep a person in their home as long as we possibly can. Living at home would be the best case scenario, but we have independent living. When we get into assisted living, that's kind of when we're in that kind of 4.2 stage to more 4.8, kind of in that range. Once we reach the stage 5.0, that's where we need to have that 24-hour care assistance. And so, the staging really kind of helps us prepare for what's coming next. So I can come to a family and say, hey, in 24 months, this is going to have to be the next decision we have to make. So it really helps them where they don't get to a point and say, oh, what do we need to do now? We have already got a plan in place for the entire progression of the illness. The last thing I want to talk about tonight is sundowning. There's a statistic down there that says 66% of dementia patients have sundowning. I think that statistic is wrong. I think it's wrong. I see probably 90% of my patients that have sundowning. And for those of you that do not know what sundowning is that number one, there is a decrease in melatonin. The pineal gland produces melatonin, and melatonin levels are significantly lower in all dementia patients, particularly Alzheimer's patients. And so we want to give them melatonin, but it's only bringing them up to somewhat of a normal level. And that's where we do need like the trazodone or something we can use to help for sleep. But then we have the environmental fatigue, we have the brain fatigue, and we see basically these patients just change personality. They'll get somewhat aggressive, they'll get increased confusion, they may not recognize loved ones, and it typically happens around the same time every day. The good thing about sundowning is that it is extremely treatable, as I said earlier, extremely treatable. We just have to know sometimes we can be on the right medications at the wrong times. I saw a patient over at Trust Point psychiatric facility the other day, and he is on some Seroquel. His medications look fine, but he's still having bad sundowning, where he's getting 100 milligrams of Seroquel at bedtime. Well, we're already past sundowning at that time. So why not take that dosage and back it up where we know that patient is very consistently have sundowning issues around 4 o'clock? Then why are we not giving these medicines at 3 o'clock? So it's really critical that not only the right medications, the right dosages based on the type of dementia and the stage, but are we giving these medications at the right times? And so that's something I'm looking at quite often there. So I'm going to show the last clip of Grace here, and then I have a few things I want to talk about in the conclusions. When we do the Q&A tonight, we're not going to use the chat box. We're going to use the actual Q&A icon in the Zoom. So I'll remind everybody that here in just a moment. But this last clip is a clip of Grace just 3 years after the clip that you just saw.
Okay, Gracie, step down. Come on, step down. Step down. That's a girl. That's the idea. Okay, now this is a real big step. This is a real big step. We're going to have to jump this one. Come on. Come on. Come on. Come on. Here we go. That's a girl. That's the stuff. That's a girl. Okay. Here we go. All right. There we go. There we go. No, wait a minute. Just a minute. Now, you gotta. Let's try this again. Come on up forward here. Come on forward. That's a girl. Push her. That's a step. Here we go. There we go, Gracie. Now push your bottom over. That's the stuff. Okay. You're gonna be okay. You're gonna be all right. You're gonna be okay. Yeah. Yeah. Isn't this a pretty day? Isn't this a pretty day, Gracie? That's a girl. That's a girl. You're gonna fuss like that all day long, are you? Huh? You're gonna fuss like that? No, don't do that. That's a girl. That's a girl. You enjoying the ride? Huh? That's a girl. There we go. Okay, now chew and swallow. Gotta chew and swallow. Come on, chew. See, this is how pretty you were there. You still are pretty. You're still pretty to me. Yeah. I can't think of one thing, one specific thing, which is the most difficult to deal with. Of course, I think, I guess I can answer that, and that is the loss of a companion. I guess the point here is that I'm married, but I'm not married. I'm married, but I'm not You know, I don't have the companionship of the woman that I've lived with for low these 40 years. And I guess if there's one thing that I think about as being the critical and greatest loss, it's just that. Grace, this is a picture of us when we were first married. Isn't this a pretty picture? There you are sitting in the chair, and there's me with my arm around you. Isn't that a pretty picture? See? You're my bride here. Well, my memory of Grace, of course, is as of the vivacious, outgoing, loving, considerate, all-fulfilling wife that she was in the most of the days of our marriage. We had a great time together. She was a great helpmate, and I just simply have to remember those days and try to put the days after her diagnosis into the shadow as best I can. Little ones to him belong, they are weak, but he is strong. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me. Yes, Jesus loves me.
So let me switch over here and stop sharing my screen. Give me 1 second here. So if you can see me now, I have a tremendous amount of respect. I had a great opportunity to meet that family. This is something that we're all here for a reason, okay? You're either here because you have a tremendous passion for these patients, and you have dedicated your career, your life, your heart, and your caring hands to treat these patients and these families, or you're here as a caregiver. I'm here for both. You know, I see my stepfather who raised me with vascular dementia, and we're doing everything we can to help him. I see my wife coming home every time she sees her father, just a broken heart. I mean, she came home the other day, and she was so just in tears that her dad wasn't able to recognize her, and that was that agnosia piece of it. And then also, you know, I've shared this in all my lectures. It was my my motivation to devote my entire career to this, is that my sister had Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome, and she passed away when she was 43. The last time I got to see her was actually at my wife and I's wedding. But I remember not understanding why she would get lost in Walmart parking lot for 2 or 3 hours, or get lost driving, not remember my name. And it simply broke my heart. And so I have it in my own family, but I can tell you that I have a passion for these patients. I have a passion for these families. And every day, I'm a very spiritual person. I have one of the same prayers every single morning, that I can wake up and not have a job, that will find a cure for this. But until that point comes, I'm going to continue to service these families, these patients. And again, I'm not really concerned about improving their memory with Aricept, but I'm more concerned about improving the symptoms. I've seen it so many times with my loved ones, of having you know, the anxiety, the hallucinations, the inability to sleep, the paranoia, the depression. And these are all things that we have to focus on. So before I open up the Q&A, I commend all of you. I honor all of you. My heart goes out to all of you and to thank you for what you do for these patients. This is not an area of medicine that most people want to go into. And so you are doing a tremendous service to not only your patients, but also their families. So I want to go ahead and open up the questions. I'm going to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. And before we get started on questions, if you want to contact my office, if you want more information from me, or if you want me to be involved in your loved one's care, I am with Blue Sky House Calls. Their phone number is area code 615-340-6840. So it's 615-340-6840. So I'm going to go ahead and open up some Q&A here. So let me open up the Q&A box here. So the first question is, my mom has vascular dementia. Can too much Xanax make her symptoms worse? That's a very, very good question. So if anytime the Xanax dosages get above 0.5 milligrams, now if she's taking it twice a day, it's still okay. But with vascular, there is the gait abnormalities. So it can increase your fall risk. But if we're using that at bedtime to help her sleep, then that's not the medicine we need to use. Xanax kicks in about 30, 45 minutes, but it also metabolizes and wears off within about 3 hours. So they'll go to sleep fine, but then they'll wake up. So as long as the dosages are not too high, we're okay. It shouldn't make her worse, but I'd be more concerned about her fall risk. So very, very, very good question there. Let's see here. We have, okay, same question here. My mom has a history. So I answered that one live. So my mom has a history of over medication. How do we learn if the source of her dementia symptoms? So if polypharmacy is a big deal. So if we have too many medications, my typical patient's on 25 or 30 medications. So less the medications, the better. Okay. So I hope that helps answer that question there. Thank you for bringing up caregivers and struggles that they're going through. How do I support them and help them find the right resources for home care? So there's a lot of great resources out there for caregivers. Number one, I would definitely suggest getting involved in some type of caregiver support group for Alzheimer's, because they're not alone. And even some stories that, that one person may be in a stage 4 and one patient may be in a stage 6. And that family that's in that stage 6 can talk about things that they did that helped. And plus it helps to realize they're alone. And then, respite care is also a good thing as well. If we look into Morning Pointe or other facilities to have respite care to give the caregiver a break. I would be very screening when it comes to having caregivers come in the home. I've seen wonderful caregivers, and there's a couple companies that I refer to a lot, but I would also make sure that we know that the caregivers that we have coming in have some form of dementia training. Let's see, how do I anticipate the speed of progression with each type of dementia? So that's a great question. So your late onset Alzheimer's disease, defined by the gene mutation has occurred somewhere around the age of 80, that's going to progress stage by stage, 18 to 24 months. Early onset Alzheimer's, when we see it in the 60s, early 70s, that progression can go from a stage of about 12 to 18 months. So it depends. Now, when it comes to vascular, it's a little harder because, remember, it's a stepwise progression. We don't understand why that happens, why a patient can be stable and then have a drop. We don't understand that yet in the research. Lewy body has a life expectancy of about 8 years, up to 10. And when it's frontal temporal lobe dementia, usually the longest patient I've ever had that had frontal temporal lobe dementia was about 9 years, but that tends to be the fastest moving of all forms of dementia. Next question here. Let me see. I've answered that one live. Next question here. Is a neurologist best to confirm which dementia or which stage? No, unfortunately, they're not. I love neurology. I work with some great neurologists, but you need an Alzheimer's specialist to do the stage. Your neurologist is maybe they're pressed for time, they're pressed for productivity. They may spend 15 minutes with you and give just a common like mini mental or quick status type exam. So you need more of I do a full neurocognitive assessment with my patients. I usually spend at least an hour, maybe even longer. So neurology may not be the best, but they do need to be a part of the care team. Very, very good question. Next one here is, my cousin is in a memory care center. They have had her on Ambien, and she only sleeps 1 hour. She won't eat. Okay, so number one, I'll tell you right now, she needs to be off, or he or she, I'm not her. Okay, she needs to be off Ambien. Ambien is contraindicated in dementia patients. It is a horrible drug for sleep in dementia patients. They can sleepwalk. They can become more confused. It has a whole host of contraindications. So anytime I see a patient on Ambien, I immediately discharge that medicine and navigate towards trazodone. Or you could do a trazodone Seroquel mix, which will help them sleep even better. So Ambien is a no-no. That's a good question. I'm glad somebody brought that up tonight. Do you have support groups in the Nashville area? I live north of Nashville. Yes. So we have Canterfield and Franklin. We do one there. We do it Harmony and Brentwood. And then we also have Morning Pointe support groups for Franklin and also for Spring Hill. So definitely Canterfield, Brentwood, Morning Pointe, and then contact Spring Hill. I know it's kind of a drive for you for Spring Hill, but also Franklin. So I actually coordinate all those Alzheimer's support groups. Very good question, Vicki. Thank you. What is the best way to prevent dementia? Are there steps young people can take to as much as possible to lower the risk? Good, very, very, very quick question. So I think this question goes a little further in depth. If you have it, and this is something I did mention earlier, if you have a history of late onset Alzheimer's disease, again, defined by that gene mutation happened around the age of 80, is not a genetic component. Okay, so if mom had it, that gives you a chance of having about 3 times higher chance of developing it. If you have mom and dad both had it, you have about a 12 times chance. But it doesn't mean that that gene is going to mutate. So when you get genetic testing, which I don't necessarily always recommend that, just because you have the gene does not mean that you're going to acquire it. I would urge you to reach out to me. You could maybe Google my name, like Dr. David Hutchings, Preventing Dementia, and the article should pop up. There are lots of neat ways in there that you can help prevent it. So just because we have the gene doesn't mean that we're going to acquire it in late onset Alzheimer's. But making sure we're maintaining a good weight, a good diet, you have to use your brain. Believe it or not, this amazing organ God gave us is kind of lazy. So learning how to do new things, challenging your brain to create new neuronal networks, and also the physical exercise and making sure you remain social. But definitely look that article up. And this is an anonymous person that chimed in here. So if you do want to reach me again, the Blue Sky office is 615-340-6840. So let me go to the next question. I answered that one there. Anyone you could recommend in Ohio? So I do deal with the Cleveland Clinic quite a bit. They are wonderful when it comes to memory disorders. So I would probably reach out to the Cleveland Clinic and see who they recommend. Also reach out to the Alzheimer's Association, because they have coordinators throughout the entire country that can help maybe recommend a practitioner that can help you. Also, Linda asked that question. Linda, I also do telehealth visits and Zoom visits as well. So if that's something you're interested in, you can certainly always call my office and we can get that scheduled for you. Very good question, Linda. And go Buckeyes. I graduated Ole Miss, but go Ohio State. You are doing well this year. Okay, so I don't see any more questions right now. We've had a lot of good questions. Okay, here comes another question here. Comes from Lori. My 85-year-old mom is in complete denial of having a stroke and denies having dementia. We've had multiple MRIs confirming multiple strokes by a physician. list diagnosis of dementia. She refuses to see any type of doctors, any way you can suggest on handling this. So with that kind of history, I would like to see the MRI, but I would bet the farm we're probably dealing with vascular dementia, okay? What I would suggest with her is with most patients, I don't use the word dementia. I don't use the word vascular dementia or even Alzheimer's. I would basically tell her that because of the stroke, that's why we're having some memory issues. And don't worry, it's not going to get any worse. Everything's going to be fine. But I think it would be a good idea for us to talk to the doctors because we can have medicines that can help with your memory. So stay away from the dementia word, stay away from those. Elderly patients cling on to certain words: pneumonia, falls, stroke. They cling on to those words. And I would say that if we don't see these doctors that can help us with this can actually cause us to have another stroke. So I use things like that, a very consistent story that kind of goes around the actual dementia diagnosis, because it is the most severe diagnosis out there. So it is good to kind of stay away from that, and maybe she'd be a little bit more open to that. And Laura, if you want to speak to me directly via phone, I'd be happy to give you some more ideas that can help with that, okay? Very good question. Okay, we have another one here from Linda. Thank you so much. I appreciate this so much. God bless you for your compassion in the population. Thank you. You know what? God is the greatest physician. I think sometimes we're just here to help people, and that's the best way to serve others. So thank you for saying that, Linda. I appreciate that. Okay, I'll answer that question there. Let's see. Lori, thank you. Greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, Lori. I appreciate that. Okay, we're going to see if there's any more Q&A here. I'm making sure I haven't missed anybody here. Great questions tonight, guys. Very good questions. Yeah, I'm just glad nobody fell asleep when I was talking. So that's a plus, right? All right, I have another question from Vicky. I echo all the kudos for you. I'm a nurse, and my mom has a newly diagnosed dementia. So, Vicky, that's, first of all, I'm sorry to hear that, but I think that your clinical training will help serve her well. I think that you'll be able to make the right decisions emotionally and clinically. And I'll say this also with Vicky's comment and another question that we had earlier here is, if you get a diagnosis of dementia, ask them what type do we have and what stage are we in. Remember, those are very, very key points there. So Vicky, that's great. By the way, Vicky, my mom was a nurse, and it was impossible to fake sick as a child. So we tried, but it never quite worked. So Vicky, if you have children, I feel sorry for them because they can't fake sick. Okay, we have a couple more here. Do you have any PowerPoints on information that was discussed tonight? I missed the first part of the class. Yeah, I'm working with Amy in Morning Pointe, and what we can do is we can get maybe the PDF of the slides sent out to you. So maybe that'll help with that too. And again, if you have any questions, I'll say my office number again. It's 615-340-6840 as well. Vicky said, I may come see you for the staging. Absolutely, Vicky, I'd be more than happy to get you scheduled for sure. Okay, so we answered that one. So the question is, so are your telehealth your telehealth, does your practice accept most healthcare plans? They do. Now, recently I've started to move away from accepting insurances, and I'll tell you why, is because insurance companies only give me 15 minutes with my patients. I'm under productivity stuff. So I usually spend at least an hour to an hour and a half with a patient, especially if I'm testing and providing a diagnosis. So I've kind of moved away from the insurance thing a little bit, but it's just kind of allowed me to provide a little bit better care. Kathy says, most informative webinar I've ever attended. Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you. I am a caretaker for my 96-year-old mother who would appreciate the PDF slides and may be in touch moving forward. Okay, perfect, Kathy. I'll work with Morning Pointe to get those slides out to you. Thank you for the feedback, too. Thank you very much. Y'all are going to give me the big head here, so. Heather says, love one on vascular dementia. I know Heather quite well. Heather is, he is constantly eating. Is there something else the caregivers can do to redirect him? He's constantly eating. I'm assuming he's probably navigating more towards sweets. That's what we see most common. As long as we're gaining weight, Heather, I'm okay with that. As long as it's not bad weights, like heart-related weights, like fluid and things that would be related to congestive heart failure. So I wouldn't be so much concerned with that. But also, Heather brings up a good point, is that there is a part of the brain that recognizes hunger, and sometimes patients don't recognize that they're full, so they will eat more and more. So as long as it's good weight, I'm okay with that. But if there's a diabetic component in there, I'd be a little bit more concerned too. Okay, we have a few more questions here. We have salt. Yep, Heather says salt and sweet to eat. Yeah, exactly. So that's very, very common because those taste buds change and we start to have a lot more sensitivity to the salt and the sweet. So definitely. Sadly, he has some heart issues, so we might even talk to like a dietitian, and they can give us maybe a better nutritional plan that can help us with that. And I've got some good dietitians that I can reach out to help you with that, Heather. Do you address caregiver guilt related to when someone needs more care? Yes, absolutely. I don't want you to feel guilt. This is a progressive neurological condition. I would say give yourself some grace, number one. Again, I'm a Christian, turn to prayer, but also give yourself some grace. This is something that is it is literally one of the most complicated neurological conditions that are out there. So when it comes to resources for more care, I mean, I've worked closely with Alzheimer's Tennessee as well, but Alzheimer's Association too can maybe help you get where you can find maybe a good caregiver support group to be involved in there. And also, if you want to reach out to me, I'll be more than happy to speak with you via phone too. And Barbara said, I'd appreciate a copy of the slides. Absolutely, Barbara. We'll make sure we get those out to everybody as well. Okay, I'm going to take a couple more questions here. Vicki said, I am a social worker in a long-term care facility. I have several patients who want to continually attempt to get up and walk. Redirection does not help. There usually causes of agitation and suggestion. So I would look at that. So Vicki, what I tend to do is when patients are constantly trying to get up, I do two things. Number one, is it anxiety related? Or is it happening a certain time of day? Or also, who was this patient before? I say that because if patients are having a lot of insomnia, maybe they work the night shift. So maybe dig in a little deeper to figure out who this person was before they acquired the illness may help us a little bit with that. But typically the constantly trying to get up, the redirection may not work. Some of that could be a medication thing that we can actually help stabilize that person's mood to help kind of stabilize them a little bit where they won't be doing that as much. So sometimes it's an easy medication change with that. Very good question. And by the way, Vicki, I'm a huge supporter of social workers. Y'all do God's work and really help navigate those families. So thank you for what you do, Vicki. Okay, let me see if there's any questions. I don't think I've missed any here. Okay. We'll take one more question if one pops in here. We'll wait a second, see if one more comes in. Okay. All right. So a lot of great questions. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take too much of y'all's time this evening. I want to reiterate again, thank you for everybody for jumping on. Just as a reminder, make sure you fill out your survey so you can get CEUs for this. I've given out my number several times, but if you need that, reach out to Morning Pointe and just tell them you need to get in touch with Dr. Hutchings at Blue Sky. And again, let's not give up. Okay. We're all here for a reason. And a lot of times I attend these Alzheimer's support groups, not only to conduct them and lead them, but also to provide more support to my wife and my family, because sometimes I speak too clinical and I want to learn how to support not only the families, but also I'm there from a therapeutic standpoint for me too. Y'all hang in there. Okay. Every day is hard. It's a challenge. But again, you drive the care. Demand to ask what type of dementia do we have? How are we going to treat it? And it's not just about the Aricept. We need to be controlling the symptoms and the psychosis related to it. My heart goes out to all of you because we're all here for a reason, and we're not going to stop fighting. And again, one day I live on a farm south of Nashville, and one of these days I'm going to be out of a job, and I hope that day comes soon. So my thoughts and prayers to everybody. If you have any questions or need anything at all, feel free to contact me. Again, thank you for joining tonight. And if you need anything, please reach out, and we'll go ahead and get all those slides out to everyone as well. So thank you again tonight for joining. Have a good evening.
Thank you again for joining us for another Morning Pointe Foundation Virtual Caregiver Cafe. And thank you, Dr. David Hutchings, a regional dementia specialist, for sharing your expertise. For those who have registered for CEUs, don't forget to fill out the survey at the end of this webinar. UTC will mail you a certificate for you to take to your accrediting agency. This is our last Morning Pointe Caregiver Cafe for 2022. We are lining up new senior experts for our bi-monthly series in 2023. If you have a topic you would like us to cover, email us at director@morningpointefoundation.com. Until next time, thank you for joining us for the Morning Pointe Foundation Caregiver Cafe virtual educational series. We will see you in January 2023.